Okay, we have an incredible situation, and for years, I've harped on this despicable thing in government called administrative powers. And for those of you who followed the national program for years, I've complained about Oregon, where I live, because of the influences that groups like ALEC and other have over the legislative body, and the fact that the legislatures pass laws which are really just kind of concepts. And then they turn those laws over to the bureaucrats who create mountains of implementing legislation that we call here in Oregon administrative rules. And there seems to be, and with the recent news about the governor of Oregon being pushed out of office for really abusing his executive powers, a lot of conversations about President Obama and his abuse or misuse of powers. Agencies like the EPA and others seem to be abusing or misusing their powers. But do people really understand executive authority, where it comes from? Our guest today is someone who does understand that. He's a professor at Columbia U. His name is Phillip Hamburger. He's a Yale Law School graduate and not a Skull and Bones member for you folks out there who are conspiracy nuts. Phillip, welcome to the show. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
First, tell people a little bit about your book and what it's about.
Well, my book's called Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And in asking that question, as you can tell, it concludes that the answer is it's probably not lawful. The book tries to explore administrative power and what it really is. And I confess, as I wrote it, I got all the more disturbed, because what we call administrative power turns out to be remarkably like what English kings called their prerogative power, a power to rule people, to control people, not through the law or through the courts of law, but through other means, through extra-legal means. English kings used to rule through their prerogative agencies, the Star Chamber, the High Commission. And nowadays, unfortunately, our government tries to control us through alternative means, not through Congress or the courts, but through the FDA, through HHS, through a whole host of administrative agencies. So the gist of it is that I fear that what we call administrative power is actually a revival of a pre-constitutional sort of power, the very sort of power that constitutions apparently were designed to prevent.
Well, let's look at something historically. Let's go back to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is known to be this great president of American history, the man who won the country's unity through what we know as the Civil War, the war against the South. There's 1,000 names for it. But he used a lot of, I would call, executive authority to kind of propel his force on the people of the South who had broken away, seceded, and created their own country, the Confederated States. Was Abraham Lincoln right or wrong in the way that he conducted himself throughout that endeavor?
Right. So that's an interesting set of questions, and I think that needs to be distinguished from what we call administrative power.
Okay.
Because a lot of his power was exercised through martial law. And one of the interesting things about the American Civil War is that although it could be viewed simply as a rebellion, one could also view the South as another nation, and so it could be viewed as a civil war, it could be viewed as a rebellion, it could be viewed as a war between two nations. And Abraham Lincoln used martial law. Now, that has very great risks, but it probably was justified by the necessity. In contrast, here, the necessity of martial law, which is allowed by the Constitution, we're talking about regular domestic control or governance, not in the wartime, but not in a civil war, but in the ordinary, mundane, day-to-day regulation of our houses, our property, our health, even our speech.
All right. So
that's different, I think.
All right. So the Environmental Protection Agency says we're arbitrarily changing the rules on coal-fired electric plants. If you can't meet these strict air quality regulations, you got to shut down, and we're going to fine you. How does that play into this?
Well, that's a nice example, isn't it, of what I would call extra-legal lawmaking. We have a constitution, and it authorizes two ways in which government can bind or control us, impose legal obligation. It can make general rules through Congress, and it can adjudicate them in particular cases through the courts. And we have Congress and the courts for these purposes. But now we have executive agencies or even independent agencies that make rules as if they're the lawmaker. And that's odd, because I thought we lived in a republic. I thought we elected our lawmakers, but no longer. So what we have is still a republic. We still elect our lawmakers in Congress, but we have a whole slew of other lawmakers who make most of the laws that govern us. It's like having a Prussian government within a republic.
All right, let's take something that everyone's familiar with, I think, and it gets a lot of media, and that's Obamacare, as we know it, the Affordable Care Act. Is what's being done there a force of executive or administrative action, or is it legit? Right.
So there are many reasonable concerns about Obamacare, and it does many things, as you know, so many that it's hard even to capture them in a 600-page book, let alone 2,000-page statute. So there are substantive concerns about the constitutionality, but what we're talking about would be the process by which rules are imposed.
Right.
And to the extent the federal government is imposing any constraint on us, not through acts of Congress and not through the courts, it seems to be extra legal power. It's a revival of precisely the royal prerogative that constitutional law developed in the 17th and 18th centuries to prohibit. It's like walking backwards towards the Middle Ages. And it's really not the way law should be made in a free country, let alone a republic with a constitution.
So they take this legislative debacle. It goes up before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, well, this isn't legal, this isn't constitutional unless it's a tax. So we're going to call it a tax. And now we've got this entity called the Internal Revenue Service who's going to chase us down and force us to pay our medical care tax or something to that effect. I'm not sure how egregious it'll get over time, but knowing government with their mission creep, we're in trouble. How do they justify that?
Right. So I confess I don't know how they justify that. I do know that it's very troubling. You know, if you think about it, our tax system has the most truncated, the most summary form of justice that we have in this country, at least domestically, right? The government essentially assesses taxes and adjudicates it through the IRS, not through a court. And it's not as if the IRS is exactly neutral in this. And now, by calling something a tax, we're taking all sorts of matters that ordinarily should have been in a court and giving them only the process that the meager process that you would get from the IRS. And that's not very encouraging. It's a way of short-circuiting, of evading our constitutional rights of process. You think about it, most of the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are procedural rights. You have a right to a judge and a jury. You have a right to due process of law. There are various burdens of proof. There are questions of evidence. All of this is protected by our Bill of Rights. But what the courts unfortunately have done is to say, well, you only get that if you go to court. But if the government goes after you without even bothering to go to court, just doing it on their own, winging it through administrative power, which they are prosecutor, judge, and jury, then they don't have to give you real due process. In fact, they say you get the process that is due. Translation, very little. It's sort of faux process instead of due process. So it's a complete evasion of our constitutional rights.
Well, I think, and my read on this, and, again, you have to look out into the future, and it's hard to predict the future, especially if you are trying to make a prediction, right? I mean, it's kind of a contradiction in terms, but the point is, down the road, okay, I don't want to pay my tax. I don't want to subsidize my drug-addicted, sexually depraved, lunatic neighbor who likes to climb high rocks in the middle of the night. I don't want to subsidize his medical care. So I'm not going to pay the tax. Now what happens? I'm going to go to jail? I'm a criminal because I don't pay the tax?
Well, that certainly looks like a possibility, doesn't it?
So, I mean, we're living in a police state. It's what we're really living in.
Well, but I don't want to give up hope, because it seems to me the current administration has actually had a clarifying effect. It has educated Americans about the dangers of administrative power in a way that no academic could ever do. And now it seems very real. It used to be people would say administrative power, it's okay because it only goes after corporations. Well, now we know it goes after individuals. And at that point, I think people are beginning to wake up and see the real danger. So it strikes me that administrative power is actually the civil rights question of our era. It's something that affects all of us. It deprives all of us of our freedom in myriad ways. And in response to it, I think there is going to be a civil rights movement against it. This happened in England in the 17th century. Why not today?
Well, today, the technology and the weapons systems the government has that they can use against you are quite a bit different than they were in the 1700s.
You know, I think truth, such as when truth goes a long way, and the mere fact that we're talking about this on your radio show is part of, I think, what can change things. I end my book with a call simply for candor, and I noticed when you began the show, you didn't say administrative law, you said administrative power. And I think that's exactly the way we need to begin. Don't call this law. Don't give it any credence or legitimacy. Recognize it as mere power.
Right. My frustration has and continues to be that our founders established a republic where no man was above the law. There were no titles of nobility. Everybody was equal in the eyes of the law. That's what the whole concept of a blind justice system is, right? Our Indeed. Scales of justice has a woman with a blindfold on. Isn't that true? But it's not like that anymore. Why isn't Bill Clinton in jail for perjury? Why isn't Hillary Clinton in jail for, various sundry of what I think are RICO violations? We'll find out in a few days, and on it goes. But but I think essentially people don't understand, and we're going to get into that in a minute, kind of the deeper history of this. We'll be back, ladies and gentlemen, with our good friend Phillip Hamburger of Columbia University. I have with us today a guest whose book I'm dying to get, and I know you will be too. It's an amazing subject, administrative law. Is it unlawful? And I'm in agreement with Professor Phillip Hamburger of Columbia U, who's here today. I think it is illegal and wrong and unlawful, whatever. The only difference is I think the people that commit these acts against us should be summarily tried and hung. Hello, Mr. Hamburger. How are you, sir?
Pretty good, thank you.
I don't mean to be so crude, but I tell you, I get tired of being pushed around. I was born love and liberty from right out of the womb, and I really want my freedom back. And I feel like I'm more and more and more and more constrained and controlled by Big Brother, so to speak, and I'm not liking it.
Well, that's why we have a constitution to enable us to limit power without having to go to extreme measures. And my hope is that the law will come back and reduce administrative power back to put it back in the box where it came from.
Well, I hope that's true. But this morning, this unsettling newscast rushed out of the screen and into my brain and began to infect me like a cancer, with John Boehner of the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the podium telling me that he's got a plan to balance the budget over 10 years. And when I got done screaming and yelling and throwing things, I realized that, that there was no hope from my perspective with people who lie to me and try to convince me that they're going to project 10 years in the future what some future Congress is going to do with the ill-gotten gain that they take from me by force. And I really just don't understand how all of this, it seems to me like there's a bigger plan working behind the scenes. I hate to be a conspiracy theorist because I'm really not one, but it just always seems to me like there's this grand lesson in moronics happening in Washington, D.C. right now, and I'm not convinced that the average citizen is getting how we're being duped. And I think administrative power / law is just one way that they dupe us. And because people really are busy just trying to survive nowadays. They don't have time to sit down and fortunately your book will be out there now. Thank you, God, knock on wood. They can get a clearer picture quick and easy. By the way, how do we get the book?
Well, you can get the book on Amazon or directly from the University of Chicago Press website. So either of those I think will do, Amazon or the University of Chicago. But I really do think that you've touched on the key point here, which is Americans need to understand exactly how unlawful the system government is. We have a republic, and that's very valuable, but we have within it a very different, more autocratic mode of governing. And I actually don't think that the people within the system are trying to hurt us or dupe us. Rather, they're true believers. They actually think they're going to help. But the awkwardness is they're helping in ways that actually are unconstitutional and that are apt to lead us in the wrong direction. So the danger is actually that those in the administrative system really believe in its value, not that they're trying to impose it on us as sort of some deception. And that's, I think, all the more troubling, but all the more reason, therefore, also to talk about it and confront it as unlawful.
Right. Well, these guys used to talk to me about what was termed or called admiralty law. And I know there was a lot of consideration about whether or not the courts in this country had come under some kind of corporate veil, that they weren't really constitutional courts. Is any of that effectively part of this, or is that just fodder for the conspiracy nuts?
Right. There's a long history to this. So the danger with admiralty law is not admiralty law itself, but rather that it is used to circumvent common law procedures. This was a problem already in the 1760s at the founding of our country, when the English government attempted to impose the stamp tax under the Stamp Act in 1766 through admiralty courts and with admiralty procedures. And one of the interesting things about admiralty is it's a civil law derived system and therefore is not ordinarily with a jury. So admiralty has sometimes been used as part of this evasion of regular due process and going through the courts. And the
All right, let me take a break real quick. Phillip Hamburger from Columbia U, his book is Administrative Law Unlawful. It's available at Amazon. If you want to go get it, I think it'll be an edifying experience for all of us. I can't wait to get mine. Don't go away. Roger Fredenberg here. Nice to be with you. We've got a topic, even though it's close to my heart here, going on about 24 years. I think I've been battling in my home state this ridiculous administrative power that just seems to permeate everything in government today. And so Professor Phillip Hamburger of Columbia U has written a book. The title is Administrative Law Unlawful. And you can get the book up at Amazon. He's here now. Phillip, thank you.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So, I guess this started, like you said, back in the old patriarchal monarchies of yesteryear. How does this philosophy, and I know people make fun of President Obama as being the king or the dictator or whatever, but is President Obama a symptom of a larger problem, or is he, encouraged by the power that he has, and is he advancing administrative authority, or, how should we look at this as Americans?
There's nothing really distinctive about President Obama's abuse of administrative power, except that he just takes it further and in a way that makes people sit up and notice. Unfortunately, this has been going on for at least 100 years. The prerogative power of kings was a personal power, and that hence prerogative power. So in the 16th, 17th centuries, this was sort of power exercised by people like James I and by Star Chamber and so forth. And constitutional law developed in 17th century England precisely to defeat this prerogative power. But what happened was that on the continent, especially in Germany, in fact, especially in Prussia, the kings decided to systematize this power and make it the sort of convert the prerogative to administrative power of the state, to develop bureaucracies and transfer their absolute power to their bureaucrats. And that sort of power was something which the Prussians in particular became quite specialized, became famous for it. So how did it come to America? Well, in the late 19th century, large numbers of highly educated, progressive Americans were slightly disgusted by the democratic process. They often complained about the rough and tumble character of democratic politics. Just to quote Woodrow Wilson, Woodrow Wilson in the 1880s complains about the difficulty of persuading, this is his language, Irishmen, Germans, and Negroes to adopt his reforms. He said such diverse peoples are not going to adopt the reforms of progressives. And so we need to have a different sort of power, one in which educated elites essentially govern. And these elites in America didn't know how to create their aristocracy until they went to Germany. Thousands went off to study in Germany. And there they studied Prussian administrative power, and then they brought it back to the United States. And they were quite proud of this German heritage until 1914. Then they decided to stop mentioning Prussia and Germany. But early administrative advocates in America were quite candid that this was drawn from Prussia. So it's very odd. America won 2 world wars, but in terms of domestic power, the Prussians prevailed.
But if the courts are not this arbiter of justice, and I'm guessing that based on what I'm hearing from you and what I'm reading about your book, you would agree with me that the courts are out of control.
The courts, unfortunately, have deferred to prerogative or administrative power, to extralegal power, in a way that James I himself would never have really expected. And so in a republic, we have something even more deferential from the courts than we ever would have seen in the past. And it's quite extraordinary. There are many reasons for this. Part of it, I think, is that the judges are from the same educated classes that sought to impose their will through administrative power. It's also, I think, that the judges are a little frightened. The progressives at the beginning of the 20th century systematically threatened the courts to try to get them to go along with administrative power, and the courts gave way. And I don't think the courts have ever recovered from that. So the result is we have timid judges. And it's sad because I think they all try to be principled personally, but they've systematically forgotten our constitutional principles.
But when you hear the term defined, they're legislating from the bench, and I hear that a lot nowadays. Is that an effect of this? How does that play into this?
Right. So judicial lawmaking, and particularly judicial efforts to rewrite the Constitution, I think it's much broader than the problem of administrative power. But certainly the judges have done some of that in connection with administrative power. Essentially, they've simply ignored parts of the Constitution. The Constitution places lawmaking power in Congress and says all legislative power is in Congress. It's not elsewhere. But the courts forget this. The Constitution places judicial power in the courts, but they go along with having judicial power exercised by the executive. And the Bill of Rights grants us all sorts of procedural rights, and that was designed to bar administrative prerogative power. But the courts then say, well, it's okay, you can get less process, the process that is due in administrative proceedings, which is practically, it's faux process, it's practically nothing. So the courts have been weak, and that will eventually be terrible for the reputation. They need to wake up.
But I mean, have the courts been weak, or have the courts been bold?
Yeah. Right. So
it seems to me like there's some pretty.
I understand.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. It just seems like the courts are pretty bold to make determinations about who has standing and who doesn't have standing.
Right.
Oftentimes giving standing to people who don't technically by law have any standing, and rejecting people who do have standing. And they seem to run their courts sometimes like administrative dictators. Or is that something that has been put on them by these other administrative power grabs? Or I'm trying to understand it because I see it a lot.
Right. So what I fear is that they're both bold and weak. The current legitimizing myth is that we've seen a great expansion of liberty, and this comes from the courts. And certainly in one or two areas, the courts have expanded upon the Bill of Rights. But at the same time, when it gets to procedural rights and some free speech rights, they've actually withdrawn a lot of the freedom. And so they go in multiple directions. The legitimizing myth is that, in fact, we've seen an expansion of liberty. In fact, I fear that's true only in a few areas. The expansion of a few rights has come with really a complete evasion of procedural rights in administrative tribunals. It's where's your right to a jury when you come before any administrative agency? It's just gone. Where's your right to have a real judge? It's gone. Where's your due process? It's gone. So they've evaded the procedural rights and expanded a few of the substantive rights.
That is that just scares the crap out of me. I'm sorry, I don't know any other way to say it.
It's very depressing.
I mean, please God, knock on wood, that I should never end up in the court system. Because I know that people like, to talk about the separation of church and state. And I know you've had quite a bit of discussion about that in your own teachings and writings. But, you used to walk into a court and put your hand on a Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, blah, blah, blah. They don't do that anymore. Does that mean anything?
Well, if you get to court, at least you will have a judge, and you will have a jury, and you will have usually due process of law. The terrible danger of administrative power is that in most instances you'll never even get into court. So, and this is really one of the sad features of modern life. The courts have actually increased the amount of due process you get in the courts, but at the same time they've deprived us of it in so many areas. When you think about things varying from licensing of drugs and devices by the FDA to every little state agency controlling anything in one's life, it's all done through mechanisms that never allow you to see a judge or jury. It consumes all of your efforts
there's a cost.
Administrative judge, so-called.
There's a lot of cost involved in defending yourself in court.
That's right.
A lot of people can't afford the process, especially in the civil realm. If you're a criminal court, they try to plea bargain you out. Gee, Bob, we don't have enough evidence to really prosecute you for the crime you committed. So, will you please admit to this smaller crime that you didn't commit, so we can avoid all this due process for you? I think, what? Where does this stuff come from? We've got thousands and thousands and thousands of people a week going to jail, to prison for crimes they didn't commit. I don't understand how you can do that. I mean, it's just like an arbitrary notion somewhere along the way in the system of jurisprudence. Somebody said, "Hey, I got an idea. Let's put people in jail for crimes they didn't commit and save the court a bunch of time and money." Yeah. Where does that come in? I'm missing that.
Right. So I don't know the statistics on, and they're probably very difficult to get at, on how many people get sent to jail or otherwise penalized for crimes they didn't commit. But certainly there's a danger of this in our legal system. There's a danger of this, though, in all legal systems. And so one of the things I hope to do is to distinguish between the costs that perhaps are inevitable in any system and the costs that are entirely unnecessary and unconstitutional. And administrative power is the sort of cost that is entirely unconstitutional and unnecessary, as opposed to the costs that have to be resisted, and one hopes that no one innocent ever gets punished. But there always is going to be a risk there, and one can't just give up on having government simply because of the risk. So it seems to me that the first target should be to take aim at those attempts to punish people in ways that are entirely unconstitutional and that are entirely unnecessary. And that, I think, is administrative power.
Yeah, well, it's to me.
Can I throw out an example of some of the costs?
Right. Well, we're gonna take a break here in a second.
Okay.
So when we come back from that short break, we're gonna have about 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll just let you just lay it out, because obviously we're gonna have you back a couple of more times in the future to get into a deeper discussion about this. But yeah, I mean, I think people are genuinely concerned about it. I really do. Phillip Hamburger's here from Columbia University. He's got a book out, which I really think you should get and read and study and devour with all your heart and soul. The book is titled Administrative Law Unlawful by Phillip Hamburger. Welcome back, Phillip. Why don't you go ahead and give us an example, as you said before the break, and a little summary or an overview?
Sure. So just take one example that affects us all. The Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, licenses new drugs and devices, and it does so on the theory that it thereby protects us from all sorts of bad drugs and so forth. And I'm sure sometimes it does stop drugs that could injure some of us. But all that the harm it saves us from is nothing compared to the harm that it does.
Oh, I believe that.
What it ends up doing is actually standing in the way of the development of new drugs that could save our lives. So just to take one little example, out of the 10 major pharmaceuticals these days, only 4 are working on new antibiotics. And this means that if ever there is a need for antibiotics, as there sure will be of a new sort, we won't be equipped to deal with it. And hundreds of thousands of Americans, if not more, may be at risk. We are creating the circumstances that may permit an epidemic. And this is because the FDA uses administrative power to control the development of new drugs. And there's a disaster waiting to happen. So the larger point is simply that in the past, when a rule was imposed that bound us legally, it came from Congress, from the state legislature. In other words, a Republican system of government where we elect our lawmakers. These days, it comes from unelected bureaucrats you've never heard of who have their own ideas about how we should be governed, and sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're wrong, and there's very little feedback there. And these days, it used to be that when the government would have an adjudication to constrain you, to punish you, it would be in a court of law with a judge and a jury and due process of law. And these days, you can't be sure of that because they can go after you administratively, and you get none of these things. You get just a little smidgen of due process, and sometimes not even that. So we've completely changed our system of government. We have the old system of government, but alongside it, in parallel, there is a new system that is without any of the procedural rights and without even elected lawmakers. And this is very, very worrisome. It's going to be a disaster, I fear.
Yeah, look, I just want freedom. I mean, is that really too much to ask? It seems like freedom is a difficult word for government to choke on these days. Liberty. These were the things that our founders praised and honored and thought highly of. And where is my freedom and my liberty to live my own life? Now, I do lean libertarian. In all fairness, I do. I used to be like a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore Republican, Christian, conservative, blah, blah, blah. But over time, maybe it's age and maturity, I'm not sure, I have come to understand how precious liberty is. And I feel like I'm being deprived my liberty. Enough that I've actually considered multiple opportunities for expatriatism because I'm just so frustrated with being bullied all the time by these rules that don't really have any lawful authority over me, and yet I'm forced to live under them. I don't like it.
Well, I think there's actually much hope for cooperation between conservatives and libertarians because although we all have slightly different visions of how we want to enjoy our liberty and exact parameters of it, there are shared obstacles to it. There are shared dangers within the government that have developed in an unconstitutional way that undermine our freedom. And I think people of all political points of view, left and right, need to get together to deal with this.
Amen. Amen to that. It
affects us all.
Amen to that, Philip. All right. Well, listen, we're going to run out of time. Get the book, Philip's book, Philip Hamburger's book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? Go get it up at Amazon, and we're going to have Philip back. I'm going to try to get you scheduled in about 30 days, and we're going to go into maybe a 2-hour show and get into greater detail. Would that work for you?
Thank you very much. I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. Bless you, sir, for your fine work and your contribution to liberty. I appreciate it very much.